Chapter 10 of Inspector French and the Cheyne Mystery by Freeman Wills Crofts. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Atul Sharma, Winnipeg, Canada. The new firm gets busy. Cheyne and Joan Merrill took a Wembley Park train from Baker Street shortly before 9 that evening, and a few minutes later alighted at the station whose name was afterwards to become a household word throughout the length and breadth of the British Empire. But at that time, the exhibition was not yet thought of, and the ground, which was later to hum with scores of thousands of visitors from all parts of the world, was now a dark and deserted plain. When the young people left the station and began to look around them, they found that they had reached the actual fringe of the metropolis. Towards London were the last outlying rows of detached and semi-detached houses of the standard suburban type. In the opposite direction, towards Harrow, was the darkness of open country. Judging by the number of lights that were visible, this country was extraordinarily sparsely inhabited. Guarded inquiries from the railway officials had evoked the information that Dalton Road lay some 10 minutes' walk from the station, in a northeasterly direction, and thither the two set off. They passed along with circumspection, keeping as far as possible from the street lamps and with their coat collars turned up and the brims of their hats pulled down over their eyes. But the place was deserted. During the whole of their walk they met only one person, a man going evidently to the station, and he strode past with barely a glance. Dalton Road proved, save for its street lamps and footpath, to be little more than a lane. It led somewhat windingly in an easterly direction off the main road. The country at this point was more thickly populated, and there was quite a number of houses in view. All were built in the style of 40 years ago, and were nearly all detached, standing in small grounds or lots. Here and there were fine old trees which looked as if they must have been in existence long before the houses, and most of the lots were well supplied with shrubs and with high and thick partition hedges. Nearly all the gates bore names, and as the two young people walked along they had no difficulty in identifying Earlswood. There was a lamp on the other side of the road, which enabled them to read the white letters on their green ground. Without pausing, they glanced around, noting what they could of their surroundings. A narrow lane running north and south intersected Dalton Road at this point, and in each of the 4 angles were houses. That in the southwest corner was undergoing extension, the side next the lane showing scaffolding and half-built brick walls. The 2 adjoining corners were occupied by houses which presented no interesting features, and in the 4th corner, diagonally opposite that of the building operations, stood Earlswood. All 4 houses were surrounded by unusually large lots containing plenty of trees. Earlswood was particularly secluded, the hall door being almost hidden from both road and lane by hedges and shrubs. "Lucky it's got all those trees about it," Cheyne whispered as they passed on down Dalton Road. "If we have to burgle it, we can do it without being overlooked by the neighbors." They continued on their way until they found that Dalton Road debouched on a wide thoroughfare, which inquiry showed was Watling Street, the main road between London and St. Albans. Then, retracing their steps to Earlswood, they followed the cross lane, first south, which brought them back to Wembley, and north, which after about a mile brought them out on the Harrow Road. Having thus learned the lie of the land so as to know where to head in case a sudden flight became necessary, they returned once more to Earlswood to attempt a closer examination of the house. They had noticed when passing along the cross lane beside the house to which the extension was being made, that a gap had been broken in the hedge for the purpose of getting in the building materials. This was closed only by a wooden slat. With one consent they made for the gap, slipped through, and crouching in the shadow of the shrubs within, set themselves to watch Earlswood. No light showed in any of the front windows, and as soon as Miss Merrill was seated on a bundle of brushwood sheltered from the light, but rather chilly wind, Cheyne crept out to reconnoiter more closely. Making sure that no one was approaching, he slipped through the hedge, and then, crossing both road and lane diagonally, passed down the lane at the side of Earlswood. There was no gap in the Earlswood hedge, but just as in the case of that other similarly situated house which he had investigated, a narrow lane ran along at the bottom of the tiny garden behind. Cheyne turned into this and stood looking at the back of the house. The whole proceeding seemed familiar, a repetition of his actions on the night he traced the gang to Hopefield Avenue. But the back of this house was in darkness, and pushing open a gate, he passed from the lane to the garden and silently approached the building. A path led straight from gate to door, a side door evidently, as the walled-in yard was on his left hand. Another path to the right led round the house to the hall door in the front. Cheyne walked slowly round, examining doors and windows. All of these were fastened, and he did not see how, without breaking the glass, he could force an entrance. But he found a window at the back, the sash of which was loose and easy-fitting, and decided that in case of need he would operate on this. Having learned everything he could, he retraced his steps to his companion, and they held a whispered consultation. Cheyne was for taking the opportunity of the house being empty, to make an attempt then and there to get in. But Miss Merrill would not hear of it. Such a venture, she said, would require very careful thought, as well as apparatus which they had not got. Besides, she added, you've done enough for one night. Remember, you're not completely well yet. Oh, blow my health. I'm perfectly all right, he whispered back. But he had to admit her other arguments were sound, and the two, cautiously emerging from their hiding place, walked back to Wembley and took the next train to town. She was silent during the journey, but as they reached Baker Street, she turned to him and said, Look here, I believe I've got an idea. Bring a long-burning electric torch with you tomorrow afternoon, and whatever tools you want to open the window, and perhaps we'll try our luck. She would not explain her plan, nor would she allow him to accompany her to the studio, so with rather a bad grace, he said good night and returned to his hotel. The next day he spent in making an assortment of purchases. These were in all a powerful electric torch, guaranteed to burn brightly for a couple of hours, a short, slightly bent lever of steel with a chisel point at one end, a cap, a pair of thin gloves, a glazier's diamond, some 20 feet of thin rope, and a 5-inch piece of bright steel tubing with a tiny handle at one side. These, when 4 o'clock came, he took with him to Horn Terrace and spread in triumph on Miss Merrill's table. Good gracious, cried the young lady as she stared wonderingly at the collection. Whatever are these? Another expedition to Mount Everest? Torch. Takes the place of the old dark lantern, Cheyne answered proudly, pointing to the article in question. Jemmy for persuading intractable doors, boxes, and drawers. Cap that will not drop or blow off. Gloves to keep one's fingerprints off the furniture. Diamond for making holes in panes of glass. Penknife for shooting back snibs of windows. Rope for escaping from upstairs windows. And this? He picked up the bit of tube and leveled it at her. What price this for bluffing out of a tight place? If the light's not too good, it's a pretty fair imitation. Also, he pointed to his feet, rubber-soled shoes for silence. She gave a delightful little ripple of laughter, then became serious. Have you no anklets? She asked anxiously. Don't say you've forgotten your anklets. Anklets, he repeated. What do you mean? I don't follow. To guard against the bites of sharks, of course, she declared. Don't you remember the White Knight had them for his horse? Cheyne was so serious and eager that he felt somewhat dashed, but he joined in the laugh, and when they had had tea, they settled down to talk over their arrangements. Then it seemed that she really had a plan, and when Cheyne heard it, he became immediately enthusiastic. Like all good plans, it was simple, and soon they had the details cut and dry. Let's try tonight, Cheyne cried in excitement. Yes, I think we should. If these people have some scheme on hand, every day's delay is in their favor and against you. Against us, Joan, not against me, he cried. Then realizing what he had said, he looked at her anxiously. I may call you Joan, mayn't I? He pleaded. You see, we're partners now. She didn't mind, it appeared, what he called her. Any old name would do. And she didn't mind calling him Maxwell either. She hadn't noticed that Maxwell was so frightfully long and clumsy. But she supposed Max was shorter. So that was that. They returned to the plan. Though they continued discussing it for nearly an hour, neither was able to improve on it, except that they decided that the first thing to be done if they got hold of the tracing was to copy their adversaries and photograph it. "Drat this daylight saving," Cheyne grumbled. "If it wasn't for that, we could start a whole hour earlier. As it is, there is no use going out there before 9. He paused and then went on. "Queer thing that these two houses should be so much alike, this Earlswood and the one in Hopefield Avenue. Both at crossroads, both with lanes behind them, and both surrounded by gardens and hedges and shrubs." "Very queer," Joan admitted, "especially as there probably aren't more than 100,000 houses of that type in London. But it's all to the good. You'll feel at home when you get in." They sparred pleasantly for some time. Then after a leisurely dinner they tubed to Baker Street and took the train to Wembley Park. It was darker than on the previous evening, for the sky was thickly overcast. There had been some rain during the day, but this had now ceased, though the wind had turned east and it had become cold and raw. Turning into Dalton Road, they reached the cross lane at Earlswood, passed through the gap in the hedge, and took up their old position among the shrubs. They had seen no one, and they believed they were unobserved. From where they crouched, they could see that Earlswood was again in darkness, and presently Cheyne slipped away to explore. He was soon back again with the welcome news that the rear of the house was also unlighted, and that the plan might be put into operation forthwith. In spite of Joan's ridicule, he had insisted on bringing his complete outfit, and he now stood up and patted himself over to make sure that everything was in place. The cap, the gloves, and the shoes he was wearing. The rope was coiled round his waist beneath his coat, and the other articles were stowed in his various pockets. He turned and signified that he was ready. Joan opened the proceedings by passing out through the gap in the hedge, walking openly across to the Earlswood Hall door and ringing. This was to make sure that the house really was untenanted. If anyone came, she would simply ask if Mrs. Bryce Harris was at home, and then apologize for having mistaken the address. But no one answered, and the demonstration of this was Cheyne's cue. When he had waited for 5 minutes after Joan's departure, and no sound came from across the road, he in his turn slipped out through the gap in the hedge, and after a glance round, crossed Dalton Road and passing down by the side of Earlswood, turned into the lane at the back. On this occasion, he could dimly see the gate into the garden, which was painted white, and he passed through, leaving it open behind him, and reached the house. The point upon which Joan's plan hinged was that, owing to the shrubs in front of the building, it was possible to remain concealed in the shadows beside the porch, invisible from the road. She proposed, therefore, to stay at the door while Cheyne was carrying on operations within, and to ring if anyone approached the house, adding a double knock if there was urgent danger. She would hold the newcomer with inquiries as to the whereabouts of the mythical Mrs. Bryce Harris, thus ensuring time for her companion to beat a retreat. She herself also would have time in which to vanish before her victims realized what had happened. Feeling, therefore, that he would have a margin in which to withdraw if flight became necessary, Cheyne set to work to force an entrance. He rapidly examined the doors and windows, but all were fastened as before. Choosing the window with the loose sash, upon which he had already decided, he took his knife and tried to open the catch. The two sashes were rabbeted where they met, but he was able to push the blade up right through the overhanging wood of the upper sash and lever the catch round until it snapped clear. Then, withdrawing the knife, he raised the bottom sash. A moment later he was standing on the scullery floor. His first care was to unlock and throw open the back door, so as to provide an emergency exit in case of need. Then he closed and refastened the scullery window, darkening with a pencil the wood where the knife had broken a splinter. As he said to himself, there was no kind of sense in calling attention to his visit. He crossed the hall and silently opened the front door to see that all was right with Joan. Then, closing it again, he began a search of the house. The building was of old-fashioned design, a narrow hall running through its center from back to front. 5 doors opened off this hall, leading to the dining room and the kitchen at one side, a sitting room and a kind of library or study at the other, and the garden at the back. Upstairs were 4 bedrooms, one unoccupied, and a servant's room. Cheyne rapidly passed through the house, searching for likely hiding places for the tracing. Soon he came to the conclusion that unless some freak place had been chosen, it would be in one of 2 places, either a big roll-top desk in the library or an old-fashioned escritoire in one of the bedrooms. Both of these were locked. Fortunately, there was no safe. He decided to try the desk first. A gentle application of the jemmy burst its lock, and he threw up the cover and sat down to go through the contents. Evidently it belonged to Blessington, and evidently also Blessington was a man of tidy and businesslike habits. There were but few papers on the desk, and these from their date were clearly current and waiting to be dealt with. In the drawers were bundles of letters, accounts, receipts, and miscellaneous papers, all neatly tied together with tape and docketed. In one of the side drawers was a card index, and in another a vertical numeralpha letter file. Through all of these Cheyne hurriedly looked, but nowhere was there any sign of the tracing. A few measurements with a pocket rule showed that there were no spaces in the desk unaccounted for, and closing the top, Cheyne hurried upstairs to the escritoire. It was a fine old piece, and it went to his heart to damage it with the jemmy. But he remembered his treatment aboard the Aenid, and such a paroxysm of anger swept over him that he plunged in the point of his tool and ruthlessly splintered open the lid. The drawers were fastened by separate locks, and each one Cheyne smashed with a savage satisfaction. Then he began to examine their contents. This was principally bundles of old letters, tied up in the same methodical way as those downstairs. Cheyne did not read anything, but from the fragments of sentences which he could not help seeing, there seemed ample corroboration of Speedwell's statements that Blessington lived by professional blackmail. He felt a wave of disgust sweep over him as he went through drawer after drawer of the obscene collection. But here also no luck met his efforts, and with a sinking heart he took out his rule to measure the escritoire. And then he became suddenly excited, as he found that the thickness of the wood at the back of the drawers, which normally should have been about half an inch, measured no less than 4 inches. Here, surely, there must be a secret drawer. He examined the woodwork, but nowhere could he see the slightest trace of an opening. He pressed and pulled and pushed, but still without result. No knob would slide, no panel to press. But of the existence of the space there was no doubt. There was room for a receptacle 6 inches by 12 by 3, and moreover, all 6 sides of it sounded hollow when tapped. There was nothing for it but force. With a sharp stroke he rammed the point of the jemmy into the side. It penetrated, he levered it down, and with a grinding, cracking sound, the wood split and part of it was prized off. Eagerly, Cheyne put the torch to the opening, and he chuckled with satisfaction as he saw within the familiar lilac gray of the tracing. Once again he inserted the point of the jemmy to prize off the remainder of the side. But the heavy wood at the top of the piece prevented his getting a leverage. He withdrew the tool to find a fresh purchase, but as he did so, the front doorbell rang. Several sharp, jerky peals. Frantically, he jammed in the jemmy, intending by sheer force to smash out the wood, but his position was hampered, and it cracked but did not give. As he tried desperately for a fresh hold, an urgent double knock sounded from below. Sweating and tugging with the jemmy, he heard voices outside the window, and then, with a resounding crack, the panel gave. He plunged in his hand, seized the tracing, thrust it and the jemmy into his pocket, and rushed out of the room. But as he did so, he heard the front door open and Dangle's voice from below. "It sounded in the house. "Didn't you think so?" And Susan's, "Yes, upstairs, I thought." Cheyne looked desperately round for a weapon. Near the head of the stairs stood a light cane chair, and this he seized as he dashed down. As he turned the angle of the stairs, Dangle switched on the light in the hall, and with a startled oath ran forward to intercept him. With all his might, Cheyne hurled the chair at the other's head. Dangle threw up his arms to protect his face, and by the time he recovered himself, Cheyne was in the hall, doubling round the newel post. Both Dangle and Susan clutched at the flying figure, but Cheyne, twisting like an eel, tore himself free and made at top speed for the back door. This he slammed after him, rushing as fast as he could down the garden. He slackened only to pull the gate to as he passed through it, then sped along the lane, and turning at its end away from Dalton Road, tore off into the night. These proceedings were not in accordance with the plan. The intention had been that on either recovering the tracing or satisfying himself that it was not in the house, Cheyne would close the back door, and letting himself out by the front, would meet Joan, pull the door to after them, walk round the house, and quietly disappear via the garden and lane. But the possibility of an unexpected flight had been recognized. It had been decided that in such a case the first thing would be to get rid of the tracing, so that in the event of capture the fruits of the raid would at least be safe. Therefore, on all the routes away from Earlswood, hiding places had been fixed on, from which Joan would afterwards recover it. Along the lane, the hiding place was the back of a wall approaching a culvert, and over this wall Cheyne duly threw the booty as he rushed along. By this time, Dangle was out on the road and running for all he was worth. But Cheyne had the advantage of him. He was lighter and an experienced athlete, and except for his illness, was in better training. Moreover, he was more lightly clad and wore rubber shoes. Dangle, though Cheyne did not know it, was hampered by an overcoat and patent leather boots. He could not gain on the fugitive, and Cheyne heard his footsteps dropping further and further behind, until at last they ceased altogether. Cheyne slacked to a walk as he wiped the perspiration from his forehead. So far as he was concerned, he had now only to make his way back to town and meet Joan at her studio. He considered his position, and concluded his best and safest plan would be to go on to Harrow and take an express for Marylebone, if he could get one. He duly reached Harrow, but he found there that he would have nearly an hour to wait for a non-stop train for London. He decided, however, that this would be better than risking a halt at Wembley Park, and he hung about at the end of the platform until the train came along. On reaching town, he took a taxi to Horn Terrace and hurried up to number 12. Joan had not returned. He waited outside her room for a considerable time, then coming down, began to pace the street in front of the house. Every moment he became more and more anxious. It was now 12:30, and she should have been back over an hour ago. What could be keeping her? Merciful heavens, if anything could have happened to her. He wrote a note on a leaf of his pocketbook, saying he would return in the morning, and going once more up to her flat, pushed it under the door. Then, hailing a belated taxi, he offered the man a fancy price to drive him to Wembley Park. Some half-hour later, he climbed over the wall across which he had thrown the tracing. A careful search showed that it was no longer there. Moreover, it revealed the print of a dainty shoe with a rather high heel, such as he had noticed Joan wearing earlier in the evening. He returned to the shrubs at the gap where they had waited, but there he could find no trace of her at all. Then he walked all round Earlswood, but it was shrouded in darkness. Finally, his taximan having refused to wait for him, and all traffic being over for the day, he set out to walk to London, which he reached between 3 and 4 o'clock. He had some coffee at a stall, and then returned to his hotel. But by 7 he was once more at Horn Terrace. Eagerly he raced up the steps and knocked at number 12. There was no answer. Suddenly, A white speck below the door caught his eye, and stooping, he saw the note he had pushed in on the previous evening. Joan evidently had not yet returned. End of chapter 10.